All right, so our next lesson is 7-3, factoring a trinomial. You'll notice that it's just an x squared with a 1 out front. The next lesson is actually with a number out there. So right now, all we're looking at is anything that has just an x squared and then plus a second term and a third term here. All right, so this is kind of one of my favorites because it's a little mind game puzzle. So the way that this was first ever introduced to me was this idea of putting a 7 and a 12, for example, in this here, and figuring out what number had to go here and here. All right. Then, from that, trying to figure out if this was a 7 and an 8, what numbers could go here. So I tend to call this the X method because we're looking at what is the pattern that you have to get this upper number and bottom number from these side numbers. So what happens is there was like a large list and they'd be on the board and then everyone was trying to kind of figure out how it happened. So what I'm going to do then is tell you that this upper number here, yes, does have to do with the number 7 and 8. And so it turns out it's a 15. And then this number down here also has to do with a 7 and an 8. And that number will result with a 56. So hopefully you can see that the idea is that it adds to be this number. So these two add to be that number. And then they multiply to be this number. So if we think of it then backwards here, if I need something that multiplies to be 12, there are only so many options, right? Our options are 1 and 12 and 2 and 6 and 3 and 4. And so of that list, which ones add to be 7? 3 and 4. So that means that 3 and 4 are going to go on the side. It doesn't matter if 4 was here or 3 was here. But the idea is that to fill in this x, these two numbers multiply to be this one. And add to be this one. And so we're going to use this idea as we go through. So it's kind of this brain puzzle, if you will. What adds to be this and multiplies to be this? And they have to be that same set of numbers. All right. So first thing that we're going to do here, and this is kind of why I use those numbers, we are going to identify a pattern. So the first thing that we did in chapter 6 was understanding how to multiply a binomial and a binomial. And so we did that by doing a box. We call it the box method or the area model. Then we would take each of these pieces, which were an x and a 7, plug them in to the rows or columns, and then an x and an 8 to that row and column. Then we multiply them all out and realize x times x is x squared, 7 times x is 7x, 8 times x is 8x, and 8 times 7 is 56. Ultimately, that then results in x squared plus 7x plus 8x plus 56. And of course, these x's, or this diagonal, can actually combine together. So if we look at what we just did here, notice that I have a 15 that I added, right, to get, and a 56 that I multiplied to get. And so that's kind of where this idea comes from. It's saying, how do I know that if I was given a 7 and an 8, that I would end up with a 15 and a 56? And that's because these two numbers at the end add to be 15 and multiply to be 56, right? So then if we go backwards to this one, notice that this is the trinomial and this is the trinomial, and we're trying to work backwards to its factored form. So really, we're actually just asking ourselves what two numbers add to 7 and at the same time multiply to 12. So again, we're trying to find out what adds to be the 7 and what multiplies to be the C value. All right. And of course, we did that in the beginning here. And so we went through each of the things that would multiply to be 12. And we found out that 3 and 4 also add to be 7. So technically, we know that we need a 3 and a 4. And so in order to factor this out, this is our result. Because 3 plus 4 is 7, 3 times 4 is 12. All right. So identifying that idea, again, is some questions that we want to ask to solve this. So if we're given this trinomial, again, no number out front except technically a 1, okay? And then a B and a C, we want to know what factor pairs multiply to be C, but then which set of factors also add to be B. And then once we find out what those sets are, then we fill them into this. Remember that when we're talking about multiplying and adding, we do not want to forget about negatives, because if in any of these problems we had a negative in here, now I'm not going to have, for instance, -3 and 4, because that doesn't add to be 7. It also technically doesn't add to be, or multiply to be positive 12 anyway. So again, what multiplies to be this last number and what adds to be this middle number? Perfect. So taking a look at this piece, again, all we're doing is asking what numbers add to be 6 and also multiply to be 5. Okay, and so the best way to do this is to write out the factors of 5. And so the things that multiply to be 5 are 1 and 5, technically -1 and -5 as well. And since it's prime, that's it. Then if we check out which one works, 1 plus 5 is 6, and -1 plus -5 is -6. And which option do we want? We want it to add to be 6. So in that case, we are looking at the set of 1 and 5. So officially, we have an x in our first term, an x in our second term, and a 1 and a 5 are the pieces that are going to add to those. Of course, you can check your answer by using the area model, filling in the pieces that you just got, and seeing if you do in fact get x squared plus 6x plus 5, which we do. So this is the factored form of this trinomial. All right. The next one here, again, we are trying to figure out what adds to be -8 and multiplies to be 15. And notice that there's a negative thrown in here, so we do want to be careful when we find our factors of 15, because we want to list all of the pieces that, yes, include negatives. So for instance, to get a positive 15, I could multiply 1 and 15, but I could also multiply -1 and -15. I could also do 3 and 5, but I could also do -3 and -5. So basically, anytime that you list a positive pair that multiply to be 15, then you want the -1 as well. And then taking a look at each of these, I want the ones that add to be -8. So the ones that add to be -8 are negative 3 and negative 5. So officially, that means that our answer has an x minus 3 and minus 5. There it is. So the next one here, again, we are trying to find out what adds to be this middle term. And of course, it's a 1. And then what multiplies to be this last piece. Be careful not to flip those around and all of a sudden try to find things that multiply to be 1 but add to be 20. So always look for addition first and then multiplying in the second one. So we just need to go through and list all the factors of negative 20. So we have negative 1 and 20, but then positive 1 and negative 20. There's also negative 2 and 10 and 2 and negative 10. And maybe you're asking, how do you get all these numbers? You can just take 20 and divide by 1, see what happens. 2, 3, 4, and so on. I know 3 doesn't go in, but 4 does. So 4 and 5, or 4 and negative 5. And then we're looking for which ones add to be a positive 1. So looking through here, this adds to be negative 1, which is what we don't want, but this adds to be positive 1. Technically, all the rest of them would get you an 8 for this one or a 19 for this one, but of course, those aren't what we want. We want a 1. So that means that our answer is going to be x minus 4, x plus 5. There we go. All right, this next piece is factoring each trinomial. So again, we're trying to find out x plus or minus something, and x plus or minus something is going to be our answer. And what those things are is it needs to add to be negative 3 and multiply to be negative 18. So factors of negative 18 to help ourselves out are negative 1 and 18 and 1 and negative 18. Just a hint, usually it's not this really big one here. Then we have negative 2 and 9, or positive 2 and negative 9. Negative 3 and 6, or 3 and negative 6. And then after that, there are no more factors. We're trying to find out which ones add to be negative 3. And so that's this one. This one adds to be positive 3, so we don't want that. And then over here, that's where we're putting our numbers. All right. The next piece is just trying to figure out if you could do this. I was hoping if we had class that you would show it to me before you leave. So the idea would be that you would take a few seconds here or minutes or whatever you need to figure out what each of these is going to be. I'll fill them in for you here right now, but again, we are trying to find what adds to be each of these numbers and what multiplies to be each of these numbers. Again, taking into consideration anything that is a negative. So again, our answer is going to be in this format, where it's x plus or minus a number and x plus or minus a number. And then again, I'm trying to get to add to negative 11, but multiply to be 30. And so maybe once you get used to this, you can, without the list, realize that 30 comes from 5 and 6, but this needs to be negative. So negative 5 and negative 6. That's a 6. This next one, again, looking for what multiplies to be 9, but adds to be 10. And as I said in the previous example, it's usually not this one, but this one actually is the larger factor. So it's going to be x plus 1 and plus 9, because these multiply to be 9 and add to be 10. All right, the next piece is what multiplies to be negative 27, but adds to be negative 6. And so we need a larger number of negative for the smaller number of positive so that we can add to be negative 6, but also multiply to be negative 27. And then the last piece, thinking of factors of 32, and then the fact that we are trying to get a positive 14 This one has to be one of those actually larger factors. So 32 or negative 32 comes from negative 2 times positive 16. And then if we add those two together, we get 14. And again, that's because I know a lot of factors of each of these numbers because I hang around with numbers a lot. But if you don't know what the factors of 30 are off the top of your head, you could have taken the time to list them out and figured out which ones add to be negative 11. And there's 2 and 15, and 3 and 10, and 5 and 6, and then all of the negative options of those. And then realizing that this is it. All right. So hopefully you took the time to do each of those, and the homework is just as breezy. Remember that you should check your homework with the answer sheet on HeadRush and then try to work backwards. But otherwise, you can go to the 7-3 assignment video and check out how I work through those. All right. Thank you.